Room is moving.
Can you see? We should turn the light on.
Yeah, I can see it, yes.
You can see it. We have trouble seeing you. Yeah. Is there a spot? Well, we are delighted here today to have Meg Urry speaking. Probably everybody knows that Meg has many interests. AGN, but if you want to hear AGN, you go to the NERCON meeting tomorrow. That's where you. So one of her long-standing interests has been the participation and encouragement of women in science, and this is a topic that she has worked on for many years. I'm sure the first women's conference in the 80s, I'm sure that wasn't the beginning of your interest, but it was certainly a landmark. And
oh, now we can see you really well. She can't see us. It's a bit dark though. Yeah, she cannot see that. Yeah, maybe that's. I think we'll just have to see you vaguely.
And Meg has long lists of accomplishments, including being the past president of the AAS, where many of these topics have been discussed. But today, we were able to lure her up, well, because of the Quasar meeting, but because of a book which came out about a year ago now, the only woman in the room. And if you didn't get around to reading the book, it was reviewed very favorably in Physics Today last fall. So you can at least pick that up. We are doubly fortunate today. Not only do we have Meg here, but the author of the book, Eileen Pollock, is here. As Meg said, kind of like the Wizard of Oz. Eileen also. Let's see. Well, first, you're going to tell us more about it, but met Meg because she was an undergrad in physics in Yale, and with many stories to tell. Having then made a very agile career change, has written several books, ran the creative program at the creative writing program at the University of Michigan. So the book is something of a combination of her interests. So it is a great pleasure to welcome both Eileen and Meg. We are webcasting it. It's going to be largely conversation and discussion. We are webcasting it. So turns out, if you're sitting in the audience and you want to ask a question, which we will ask the speakers to repeat, you're going to be pretty anonymous. On the other hand, if there's anybody who would like an even more anonymous session, just come up and tap me on the shoulder, and at the end of the meeting, we'll turn off the webcast if you want to have something which is a little more private than that. So anyway, it is with great pleasure that I welcome Meg and Eileen.
Thanks very much.
You
Let
need
me
stuff
steal
here.
this back from you. Yeah, thanks. Great. So I at least can be heard. Thanks. Good. Okay. So Eileen, I think I'll just tell them how you and I met, and then you can tell them tell them about the book and why and what it says, and then we can. Okay, so I'll just go. So I was the physics department chair at Yale, and I get this yard-long email from this woman I don't know, explaining that she had gone to Yale as an undergraduate. She graduated in 1978 as one of the she and her classmate were the first two women to ever major in physics at Yale. And it wasn't the best experience of her life, I guess. And it was so she did extraordinarily well in physics, but came out feeling like she was not cut out for it, and went and became a superb writer, thank goodness, because she wrote this great book. So she and I met there. She came to talk to me, and it turns out we're like two test particles that went through different trajectories, because I graduated from Tufts in 1977, and so we're kind of like alter egos. So I'm going to let you talk about the book, and then maybe I'll say a few words about like today's situation in physics. Okay?
Right.
Okay.
The book is basically But, I'm hearing my own echo. I wonder if we can.
I think it's because I'm standing there. I need to go like farther. I'll turn this off while you're talking. Yeah,
Okay, that's better.
That's better,
Great.
yeah.
Can you still hear me?
yep.
Okay, great. The book is basically why I didn't end up Meg Urry, which I much rather would have done. I would love to be sitting there among you as a theoretical physicist. So let me explain a little to you how I came to love physics and why I didn't go on in it. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York and loved both writing and science and math. And the reason I became very determined to become a physicist and really fell in love with the subject was that when I was in 7th grade, some of the boys in my class were jumped ahead a year or two in science and math because our school didn't have any advanced classes in, say, physics or math. So they would be able, when they got to be seniors, to go to the community college and take those subjects. And I wasn't allowed to move ahead with them. And when I had my mother ask the principal why, he said, first of all, that it would have ruined my social life. For those of you who are girls in 7th grade who love science and math already, you know you don't have a social life anyway. And he said that it would be just wasting a seat because women never went on to careers in science and math, which of course is interesting reasoning. If you don't let them take the courses they need to go on in science and math, they won't. So being the kind of person I was, I became determined to prove him wrong. And I basically just started staying home from school and reading anything I could get my hands on about physics, biology, chemistry, and eventually taught myself calculus from a book. I got into Yale because they had just started taking women. They needed women. They didn't have kids from public schools. But when I got there, I was just completely blown out of the water. My freshman physics class was 118 guys and me and one other woman. And they had taken 2 years of college physics and 2 years of college calculus. And, I basically scored the very bottom of the class for my midterm. But I actually had wonderful professors. They were young guys. They were great. I was kind of in love with them all, which I probably shouldn't admit, but that's one of the reasons I stuck with the subject. I went to drop, basically everybody, my parents, nobody could understand why I would want to major in physics in the first place. They all said, English is such a nice career for a girl. Why don't you just get a degree to teach high school English and then marry and have a kid? So I thought, all right, everybody wants me to switch to English, I will, but my professor wouldn't sign the drop slip. And he just said, okay, you're behind now, but just stop watching the swimmers in the other lanes. And he said, you'll catch up. And he gave me Richard Feynman to read. And by the end of the semester, I think I scored 3rd or 4th highest on the final. And, as often happens, if you think you're behind, you work 2 or 3 times as hard as everybody else. And, in some ways, so all the guys were doing the problem sets collectively in the male sort of entryways. And I had to do the problem sets all by myself. So I was putting in, 20 hours on the problem set. They would say, you take problem 1, you take problem 2. So it took me a lot longer, but of course you end up knowing how to do all the problems. But I always thought I was behind. Anyway, by the end, by senior year, I think I got 1 B+. All the rest were A's. I had I taught myself to program the mainframe, and I got an internship at Oak Ridge. But what I really was interested in was theoretical physics. I took a grad course in cosmology. I took very advanced math classes. Aced them all. And I'm saying this not to brag, but because I think Meg and I both talked about about this. There's a sense, I think, that if someone is meant to be a physicist, and if they're really good at it, they will succeed no matter what. And I've heard that from so many, especially men, but some women too, that if you're really good, nothing will stop you. So I kind of always have to brag a little and say, actually, I was really good. I did a senior a thesis with actually somebody in the math department. It was completely theoretical. It ended up being a publishable paper. I was invited to a conference in theoretical physics. And, I typed up that paper, left it with my advisor on graduation morning, and left physics forever. And I didn't really understand why. It was very painful to me. I felt that I had just proved what my high school principal had said, that women just don't go on in physics or math. I was ashamed. It was painful. So I just pretended it had never happened. I made myself over into being a writer. And that was kind of my secret until 2005, when your former president, Larry Summers, made history by asking where were the women senior physicists on his faculty. Now, I actually was friends with Larry. We went way back to high school debate. And so, apart from the whole controversy that erupted in the New York Times, as one friend to another, I sat down to write him an email. I wanted to say, Larry, here's what happens. Here's why you don't have all those women on your faculty. And next thing I knew, it was 2 a.m, and I had a 20-page email to Larry, which I have to say, even if you're sort of friends with the guy, if he's the president of Harvard, you don't just send a 20-page rant that you finished at 2 a.m. And more to the point, I realized that I didn't even know why I hadn't gone on. I really didn't understand my own reasons. I had loved it so much. I still loved it. I had been so good at it. Why didn't I go on? So as a writer, I thought, well, when you have a big question like that, that's a book, right? We do our own kind of research. So I spent the next, 6 years going back to my own past. So I went back to my hometown. I talked to my former classmates, my teachers who were still alive. I went back to Yale to talk to my former professors. I met Meg. So I tried to figure out why I had left. And then, of course, you're always afraid you're an anomaly. So I talked to other women I had known, the other woman physics major at Yale. And then I thought, but surely things had changed. And so I wanted to be able to compare my experience to young women today. So I interviewed a lot of young women at Yale, at Michigan, and other places. And then toward the end, I knew that scientists would be reading this book and they'd want some data, some studies. So I also tried to look at, just as the book was coming together, people were starting to do studies on gender bias. And I finished the book and I couldn't get it published because editors said nobody would be interested. But I managed to get an excerpt from it in the Sunday New York Times magazine, and lo and behold, it went viral. And I heard from literally thousands of people about their connection to the piece. That helped get the book published. And so there's also an epilogue that comes from what I learned by sort of an informal survey of these several thousand women and men who had written to me about their response to the article. Or I then went around for, actually the book's been out since, I think it's 2015, so it's been out for years. So I've gone around giving a lot of talks and have heard a lot of interesting responses, but that's kind of the epilogue to the book. So I'll stop there and actually give you some idea of what The Only Woman in the Room. The original title was Approaching Infinity, which is more of a physicist title, but they didn't think anybody would understand that, except they changed it.
Yeah, and I can highly recommend the book. I mean, I bought 50 copies of it at a discounted price, I have to admit. And I've given them all away, and I need to go buy another 50 so I can give those away. Because I think it really explains what it feels like to be the only woman in the room, or one of few women in the room. Now, at the time that Eileen visited Yale in 2010, we had a third of our physics majors, undergraduate physics majors, were women. The national average is 20%, or just a bit below, and we were way ahead of that. And I think in part it's because we have some women faculty, we have a women department chair, those things make a difference, the role models make a difference. But it's really, so it wasn't, so the young women in our classrooms today don't have the experience that you and I had of being the only woman in the room yet. So at the undergraduate level, not really, and probably at the graduate level, not really, although it's not as good as it was at undergraduate years. But eventually you do get to the place where you're the only woman in the room. And the one point that I wanted to make about this, I think we've made a lot of progress, but we're clearly not there. And one of the biggest problems I see, and this pertains only to academia, but you can imagine the analogs in other professions, the criteria that we judge people on, they're very clear. When you hire someone or when you promote them or give them tenure, we care about letters of recommendation. We care about how much grant money they brought in, how many papers have they written, how many citations have they gotten. I always forget one or two things off this list. Help me out. What else do we care about?
Mentoring students.
What?
Mentoring students.
Oh, we don't care about that at all, Avi. Avi says mentoring students. If we cared about that, all the women would sail through tenure and the men would have a hard time, but that's not true. So we don't care about that at all. What else?
Are they first author?
Are they first author of the paper? Yes.
Only.
What have they taught? You know, we don't care too much about teaching, but they should have. It's interesting. Some of the women have taught at Yale. The women preferentially teach the introductory classes and the classes for non-scientists. One of my colleagues, Sarah Demers, is about to come out with a book called The Physics of Dance, which is just an amazing class that integrates the history of dance with physics theory, and it's just great. Anyway, that could be looked at as a huge benefit to the university and the department and the whole interdisciplinary thing that Yale's particularly known for. But in fact, the way it gets interpreted is that, you know, maybe she's not up to teaching quantum mechanics, and maybe it would be good for her if she did. That's how that gets interpreted. That's why I know we don't care about mentoring students. So there's a bunch of criteria, and all the ones I've mentioned and the few that I've forgotten, every single one of them has been shown through experiment, through verifiable, repeatable experiment, to have gender bias in it. Women are less likely to be cited than men. Men cite men much more than they cite women. Letters of recommendation for women and for men are different. I've been reading letters of recommendation now for decades, and I swear if you gave me a stack with the pronouns removed, I could tell you which ones were written about women and which ones were written about men. These things are known, and they're, as I say, found in repeatable experiments. And yet, grants, I should talk about grants, and telescope time for astronomers is very important. I'm sure you're familiar with the studies that were done at the Space Telescope Science Institute about the publication of, about the review of proposals. That senior women have about a 15% chance of getting a proposal accepted, when young women and men of any age have about a 25% chance of getting a proposal accepted. There's similar, different kinds of bias, but also a disadvantage for women in European proposals at ESO. And Spitzer has also looked at this. Chandra has looked at it. Chandra is now, seems to be at gender parity, but there was a big gap at the beginning. So the point is, we count whether people are able to succeed in a peer review system. Are you able to get your observing time and get your grants? And yet we can show that women are disadvantaged in that process. And I should just say, for those who aren't familiar with Space Telescope proposals, they are all multi-author proposals written by a team, which is definitely both men and women, usually more men than women. And so what we're talking about is just the PI's name. Whether it's the gender of the PI's name makes a difference, even though 20 people wrote all the proposals, and they have to be of similar quality. That is, it's not tenable that the women somehow wrote crappier proposals. Okay, so we have a system that is better than it used to be when we were youngsters, but it's far from equal. I see there are some younger women in the room. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have been told And young men too, if you've heard this, how many of you have been told that you'll have an easier time because you're a woman and affirmative action means you get a preference? Right. Pretty much every young woman gets told that. And yet, look at our faculties. You know, look, where are these women who've had the extra chances? I mean, if that were the case, there would surely be more of them rising through the ranks. I will say that the gender equity in astronomy has changed a lot since I was starting out. And I think we're near parity at the undergraduate and graduate student level. It's pretty much close to 50%. And it's small number statistics. Astronomy is not that big a field, so it's hard to tell whether that's propagating properly, but it certainly looks okay right now. Interestingly, physics, which has the same skill set, physics is going much more slowly toward parity. Do we lose her? No, thank you. Oh, somebody's trying to message you? That's Francesca's computer. If you see anything intriguing, just, shout it out. So I think we have a problem, and many of the women in astronomy start in physics, right? If you're at a smaller college, you probably don't have an astronomy major, you have a physics and astronomy major. So physics seems to be much more resistant to women, or much more naturally incorporates women. So I think there are many reasons for this, and we can talk about them. And there's lots and lots of social science research that explains everything. One of the things that that people always say, well, what's the reason? Like A, there's only one reason, and B, there's many reasons. But I think a big part of it is we don't see women as scientists. When we look ahead on the who's in the faculty, or who's here at CFA, for example, who are the senior scientists here at CFA, there are not very many women. And so it's even someone as talented as Eileen, comes away from her undergraduate experience thinking this is not for me. And actually, one thing you didn't say, Eileen, but I've heard you say before, is that people in English were just much nicer and very welcoming and very encouraging.
Right.
And also, one of the questions she asked these professors that she went back to talk to is, why didn't you encourage me to go on in physics? And the answer was basically, well, I don't know, we didn't encourage anybody. One guy said to you, it's such a terrible life, I would never encourage anyone to do it. I'm thinking, what? Terrible life? Geez. I mean, we cannot get faculty to retire, They don't want to retire. So how bad could it be?
Well, let me speak to some of that, Meg. So, Meg certainly knows a lot more than I do about what happens if you actually stay in the field, but having left, I can be a lot more honest than a lot of people about sort of the deeper psychological and cultural factors. But just one thing about what Meg was saying about the disparities in, say, funding, or you talk about time on the telescope, even in fields where women seem to have parity, I think it's really dangerous because women. Wait, I'm echoing again.
Oh, sorry, I got too close. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the women aren't even expecting there to be any bias against them. Back in the day, Meg and I would have expected, that we were going to be running against gender bias, but young women today don't expect it, and I think therefore it's even more dangerous. So there was a study in biomedical research. It was done by a researcher in Boston, Robert Segi, and he looked at men and women with full qualifications getting their first lab in New England, and looking up startup packages. And the disparity was shocking. It was something like $350,000 to set up your lab if you were a woman, and something like it was close to $900,000 if you were a guy setting up your lab with the same qualifications, right? And that's in biology. Where everybody thinks it's all equal. And just think how that propagates over the years. So if you have that much less to set up your lab with, right, and then that much less, fewer results to apply for your first grant with, it's just going to snowball, right? And neither the man nor the woman knows that one's getting $500,000 more than the other to start out, right? Now, why is that? Did the woman not know to negotiate? Was she offered less? They're still figuring that out. But there are also just these, I'm more interested in studying the factors that keep girls from even getting to the point where they would be, graduating with their PhD and getting their first job. So as Meg said, I think encouragement or lack thereof is just a huge factor. It was the biggest factor in why I didn't go on. I had worked so hard and I was doing so well. I thought somebody was going to say to me, gee, Eileen, you're really good at this. You're going to go on to grad school, right? Let's talk about where you're going to go. What are you going to do? And nobody ever said anything. And, as women, I think we're raised more than men to look to others to tell us how we're doing, to give us approval. I thought that all the professors in the department got together and looked at everybody's transcript, talked about the students and thought, oh, this one's good, this one's not good, and then encouraged some people to go on. They didn't care. Nobody knew that I got all A's or took grad courses as an undergrad and got it. Or later, as Meg said, when I asked my advisor why he hadn't encouraged me to go on, oh, we never encourage anyone. But of course they do. A lot of times people don't realize that they are encouraging some people more than others. So there's this whole encouragement factor, which I think ties in to something else, which is that to do what you are doing, to do what a physicist or an astronomer does, or any scientist, you have to be really confident. You have to believe you can figure out something about the universe that nobody figured out before, or that other people are wrong and you're right. And to do that, you have to see yourself as smart and bold and capable. And that's just not what young women and people of color they're not being fostered that way. Yeah. The other thing that and that's just as true, I think, today as it was that I hear that, I've heard that from the most people, the most women of anything. The other thing that hasn't changed, and in fact, I think has gotten worse since Meg and I were young, are the way the culture, there's an even bigger gap today between the way I think scientists are represented and the way young women are encouraged to see themselves, right? So Meg and I grew up in the 60s and 70s when we were still reacting against the 50s. So, we're kind of hippies, or even if you weren't a hippie, you didn't get your hair done, you didn't get a manicure every week, you didn't wear high heels, you didn't even wear a dress, right? We all you wore t-shirts and jeans. So you kind of look like a scientist, even if you're And that hasn't, so the image of scientists hasn't changed today, right? If you look at the Big Bang Theory, right, they still, a scientist, a brilliant scientist is Sheldon or Howard or Raj or any of them. But a woman still looks like Penny, right? And there are a couple of women scientists on that show, but they're shown to look sort of very unfeminine, dumpy. Amy looks kind of not typically feminine. And yet, young girls today are being brought up in a society where there's this whole princess thing going on. There's a very sexualized image being fed to young girls. And the notion of what it means to be a mother or a wife has gone back even before the 50s. I mean, it's just over the top, romanticized, feminized. And so there's an even bigger gap between what a scientist still looks like white male, in a t-shirt and jeans, and what a girl is supposed to see herself as. And when girls are making these decisions about their lives or how they see themselves, in junior high school, first couple of years of college, culturally, they're still not able to see themselves as fitting in. And then the culture of science, especially in grad school, I think is still sort of brutal. It's sort of a hazing. It's unpleasant in ways that I think most women still really don't want to put up with. Medical school used to be that way, and I think that's, why we lost so many women. And when they changed medical school so it wasn't such a hazing, I think not only did men benefit, but that's why there are so many more women doctors now. But this notion in graduate school that women are still being told, you have to be there 24/7 and you can't have any other interests. not only is it literally not, all that suitable for a healthy life and raising kids, but it really discourages a lot of women, I think.
There's one more thing too, which I wanted to add, which is that this issue of confidence is an interesting one. I had a young woman come into my office once, shortly after I got to Yale. She just wanted to meet me. I'd never had her for a class. She just never met a woman in physics before, so she came to see me. And we were chatting, and I said, "Oh, are you, you're graduating? Are you going to graduate school?" And she said, "Oh, no, I'm not smart enough for that." And I said, "Oh, how are you doing in your classes?" "Well, mostly A's, but I have some B's." I'm like, "Oh, so you're at the toughest college in the country to get into. You're doing a physics major, which is probably one of the tougher majors at the college. You have mostly A's. What the heck is not smart enough about that?" It was really interesting. She had the same, this was in 2002, 2003. She had the same feeling you did, 25 years earlier. And also, the other side of the square, I was talking to a colleague of mine who was the chair of another department, and we were talking about our kids, actually, and he was saying how his son was just much more studious than he had been as a college undergraduate, and that he had really, a lot of drinking, a lot of partying, C average in his science classes. And I looked at him and I'm like, "Oh my God, you had a C's in physics and yet you went on to graduate school?" I can't think of a single human being I know but yet no women would ever do that, right? You have a bunch of C's, you're like wiping, it's over. It's over for you. And of course, this guy is really smart, and he's a great professor, and he had been a screw-up in college, so it wasn't a crazy thing, but that difference between, women getting an A- and thinking life is over, and men getting C's and thinking, well, the professor was stupid and that exam wasn't fair. You guys are professors, don't you get that? People come and yell at me that the exam was bad, that's always a guy. And people come in and cry that they feel bad that they should have studied more and that they're not smart enough, and that's always a girl. Always.
Right.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's in fact been studied. And
Yeah.
the typical thing is there's a researcher named Shirley Carrell. She started as a high school chemistry teacher. She later went on and she's a professor at Stanford. But she noticed that happening with her students, that the guys didn't study and then they got a C and then they brag. And she knew they got a C, right, because she knew the marks. And they would brag after the test, "I didn't study and I did great." And the women would study, get one problem wrong, get maybe an A-, and say, "Oh, I worked so hard and I failed." And they would listen. They would ask each other after the exam, how did you do? And each would believe the other. So the women believed that the guys were geniuses without studying, and the guys thought, "Oh, women study hard, they're kind of drones, and then they don't do well." Just two other little examples, because I think hearing how this works really helps.
Yeah, but then we should take some questions, okay?
Okay,
As soon as you finish, yeah.
So there's a researcher named Virginia Valiant, and she was thinking about why guys do so much better on those math Olympiads. And they found that girls thought that you had to follow the rules, that if you took a shortcut, it was cheating. Whereas the guys would do that thing, like if you have to add up the numbers from 1 to 10, and you figure out that 1 plus 9 is 10, and 2 plus 8 is 10, right? So it's all 10 times 5. The girls thought that was cheating, right? Because they had been brought up to be good. And the minute you told them that, no, that's what you're supposed to do, and they had the confidence, they could see the same patterns. Last thing, how much popular culture affects our images. I don't know how many of you saw Hidden Figures. I hope it was all of you. But there's a moment where the, African-American woman who's going in for the very first time to that group of male scientists at NASA opens the door, and she sees all these white guys in shirt sleeves with the string tie, and they all look like geniuses. And I felt that way. I thought, oh yeah, she's the black woman. She can't be the genius. They're all the geniuses. And by the end of that movie, she is up on the ladder writing on the whiteboard, and they're all looking up at her trying to follow along. And I just felt paradigm shift even in my head. Like, oh, she's what the genius looks like. They're the drones, right? And it's those kinds of shifts that we need in the way our thinking is formed that are going to make any kind of difference. So
Yeah, that's a great point. So
I think we'll let Francesca, who was a postdoc of Meg's, another level,
calling people?
take care of the.
Yeah, so we can, the meantime.
Oh,
Yes.
with this, yes. Much of a talk.
So,
Yeah, because we really wanted to have a discussion, just have, people raise issues they were interested in.
As I said, but not hesitant to lead off. I'm interested in all your comments. Being a good deal older than either of you two, but when I was in high school, it can't be quite right, but I don't think anybody had ever been to an Ivy League college in my class in high school, and. Oh, okay, right. So I was talking with a friend of mine from high school just a couple of years ago. She'd gone to Brown and I'd gone to Wellesley, which is women. And she was saying, it was really funny. I did really well in English, not science, but nobody ever said, you should think of going to grad school. And I thought about that a little bit afterwards and I thought, you know what? At Wellesley, nobody ever said you should go to grad school. It was just what you did. I mean, it was just sort of in the air. Not saying that that's the answer for everybody, but when you talk about influences and role models and so forth, as I say, I said, oh my goodness, what a different experience we had.
Peers are really important role models as well, yeah, or opinion shapers. We were at a visiting committee once talking to a group of undergraduates, men, and we asked if they ever, this is a committee of women, senior women in physics. We asked them if they did their problem sets in a group. And they said, yeah, we do it every week. I said, are there any women in the group? Oh, no. I said, why not? Well, we want to study with the smart people. And this was, a youngster, not that long ago, 10 years ago. And I thought, wow, that's still the attitude, right? That's still the attitude. And then we said to him, well, do you know that the women are not doing well? And he sort of thought, he said, well, now that you say that, I don't really know. I just assumed they weren't doing well.
I would say, too, as far as single-sex institutions, after I had been on the road just a little while giving talks about my book, I could easily tell which women had been to single-sex, their high school to colleges. They just said, I don't know what you're talking about. None of this is in my psychology. And, I'm sure there are other pros and cons, but I think there's a way in which going to an all-women's high school or college sort of inoculates you against some of the mental and social kind of handicaps, I would say, that a lot of other women who are, in the broader society that being burdened with.
Yeah, go ahead. I can come over.
I have a question about introductory courses in math and science in college. I was a math major at UC Berkeley, so my introductory classes were giant lecture style classes where we had, a big midterm and a final. And that was a really bad learning environment. It got a lot better when I was in the smaller upper division classes where, and are there colleges where they're sort of rethinking that model a lot? So you're sort of less with that lecture and then the big exams and then.
That's a really good question. I mean, I can answer for Yale. Certainly, we still have the big intro classes, although they're not as big as UC Berkeley. And big class for us is 100 kids. But if you go to the liberal arts classes, the liberal arts colleges, they have at most 50 students per class and usually smaller. And their students are much happier, and they have many more women in their classes as well. It's an interesting point where you feel you're not lost, right? You're not lost in the big, vast auditorium.
But there's also this ethos that I didn't even know existed until I went around doing this research, which that there's an intentional philosophy called the weed out philosophy, that these intro courses were designed to be brutal and weed out anybody who didn't come in already super prepared and super confident. And I found that shocking because first of all, that's not true with the humanities. We're trying to get people, and we encourage people. But to think that age 18 already, people should be weeded out. And anybody who didn't get to go to a great high school or hadn't been, assigned to since birth wasn't qualified, that you should gleefully weed them out. Shocking. And I hate to say it, some institutions that philosophy still persists.
Yeah. Roseanne? Oh, yeah, here. Sorry. I forget that I have to do this.
Thanks. Well, I think the things we're talking about young people, whatever level of school they're in and whether they go on, this is something of concern to all of us. And a lot of us have kids and we want to make sure that everybody has a level playing field. Something that Meg, though, said really struck me. It hit a chord, and she'll probably understand why. And I was wondering if we could spend a little bit of time on that, because I think it's the lack of senior scientists at, as you said, at an institution like this. So, I look around here and I see my male colleagues whom I literally love and you really feel fond of. I mean, it's true. I appreciate all of the people that I've interacted with here, but I also can't even begin to tell you what my experiences have been here without, turning it into something quite different. And but I think apart from the experiences, it's the statistics, right? I mean, and I know that everybody here, male and female, wants those statistics to change, but they are what they are. We had a woman on the faculty at Harvard in Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin in the 1950s. She was, after 20 years of not being paid or being paid very little, she suddenly was asked to be on the faculty. I don't know what the size of the faculty was at that time, 5 people, 10 people, or whatever. Well, today we have a wonderful Harvard faculty. Every single one of them is wonderful. I don't know if the total number, and Avi and David are here, they can say, how many men though? How many men?
16.
So 16, and we got up to 2 within the past few months, maybe the past month. In SAO, we have federal versus other positions. Years ago, it was 60 some odd to 5. Many men have retired, and so the total number has come down, changing the ratio somewhat. But nevertheless, a handful of men have been hired, and a couple of women have been hired in that time. Those are our senior women. We have an AD session where people advise, they sit on the committee that advises the director. I'm not aware, there may be 8 of them who are women, but at least as far as I'm aware right now, out of the 6 to 8 people who sit around that table, there's no woman AD. And I will tell Avi this now, and he knows how I feel about him and how much we've interacted in a positive way through the years. We have an Institute for Theoretical Physics, an ITC, which is in fact an amazing place that has been built by a number of people, but Avi has done a stupendous job over the past years. We have a picture, we have a place where we display the images of everybody in that ITC. I have never put my picture there because for very concrete reasons, not that I'm not included, but for very concrete reasons, I am treated differently from every senior person there. And much as I love the place and much as I feel comfortable with, I think you all know, I go to lots of different talks and talk to all of you and have a great time here. I have not ever put my picture on that board. And that's not a statement of weakness. It's a statement that I'd like things to change, really. What I feel we need, and maybe some of us here have the wisdom to do it, male and female. This isn't just for women. This is for everybody. How do we change this situation? not so that it takes another 20 or 30 years to achieve equity, but so that we can really say we've made progress 5 years from now. We come to this room 5 years from now and we can pop up and say, you know what? Things are different today from what they were 5 years ago. And here's the proof of it. Because once you start making progress at that senior level, then you've got ingredients that help us to do all of those basic things for younger people.
Thanks. That's a good comment. I don't know if anyone here wants to comment on that. Do you want to say something, Jim?
I was going to say something different.
Oh,
But I can relate to that.
okay. You want to say something?
So, I mean, there are two organizations here at the CFA, the Smithsonian and the Harvard College Observatory, and I cannot comment on the Smithsonian because I'm on the other side. But on the Harvard side, we are basically limited by the searches that we are authorized to. And during my term as department chair, I try to do the best I can within the searches. So over the past 3 years, we didn't have a search. But the idea I very much sympathize with, that we really need to correct the mistakes of the past. And I think it's really unfortunate that our department has such a history.
Any other comments on this topic?
What would happen if well, it wouldn't be for senior, but just for the faculty as a whole, that you couldn't do a search unless all the candidates were either women or people of color? And that's pretty much the situation in Michigan now, at least in the humanities, but I think across the college. You basically can't do a search unless all the candidates are either female or people of color. Because otherwise, I mean, with the number of people who turn over every year, it is going to take 50 years to change the composition of the faculty. So that's not quite answering your question about how you get senior people. But that's the only way you can change the numbers sooner than 50 years if you're just waiting for attrition and the occasional female or faculty member or person of color.
It's kind of interesting. You know, many professions have changed faster, like medicine, for example, has changed a lot faster. It's over 50% of the medical degrees now go to women. But if you look at academic medicine, which has the same number of hurdles and kinds of hurdles as academic departments do in the main, you know, in the college or the university, you see very, very few women. Very few women in the fancy track at medical schools. They're all in the clinical track, being paid less, too. Oh, yeah, we didn't discuss pay. We didn't discuss pay, yeah. There you go.
Thanks. So actually, it's a question for you. So you started this talk by noting how, bless you, how our methods for selecting who advances are all gender biased, how we look at things that we already know are gender biased. Why can't we change that? You're ahead of a department.
Yeah. Yeah. So really good question. And I think, and there are strategies that have been shown to reduce bias. Basically, the things that create bias are the following. Having people make up their minds before coming to the discussion. Doing things under pressure. For example, you have 500 applications and you need to, you know, decide by 3 days later who the best people are. That any kind of time pressure. If you have a rubric, for example, when I was doing a search, we had a conversation beforehand about what kinds of people we were looking for. You know, what science areas, what other things were important besides the research, you know, where our department was lacking, you know, what we could fill in. And we did that before we even wrote the ad, so that those things are in our minds. And then when we had applications, we were supposed to, although I don't know how, to what extent people did this, but we were supposed to judge every candidate against the things we wanted, so that you are thinking about criteria explicitly with each candidate. And then, without having ranked them or made up your own mind about who you think is the best person, you go to the discussion and you have a real discussion as opposed to a political discussion to try to get your candidate hired. And those have been shown, at least in slightly artificial social science experiment environments to produce results that are less biased. Oh, so when I went to Yale in 2001, we had 0 women in the physics department. I was the first, and I found out later I was the first ever to have been tenured by that department in 2001 when Yale was 300 years old. We now have 6 women, of whom 5 are tenured. And it has changed the department. It is really different. And I would say that at least 3 of those women, at least 3 would not be there if I hadn't been department chair at a crucial moment. And they are all high flyers. They are all doing extraordinarily well, and they are incredible colleagues, and they're working far harder than anybody else in the department. And we are lucky to have them. But it took a lot of pressure, and I will also say a lot of resources from the university, because 5 of those 6 women, including myself, were hired with extra resources from the university. Because we were women, the university gave us an extra slot. And none of us would have been hired without that extra slot. Only one was hired sort of straight in. And the same with our one African American professor. He was hired with an extra slot. If you think about the department before and after those women and that African American guy were added, you know, if you took just the white guys and you took some out and put some others in, it really doesn't change the experience very much for the students. Those guys think alike. I'm overgeneralizing. They don't all think identically, but they have similar approaches to things. And when the women came in, we had very different approaches, and I think that strengthened our department. And now everyone's interested in these different points of view now, where before it was just sort of assumed, well, this is the way we do it, because we all agree. I think it's good to have some variety.
You mean those positions were added? There wasn't a search already going on. It was sort of a targeted hire for
No, it wasn't a targeted hire. What it was we would do a regular search, and the number 1 candidate would be a guy, but the number 2 candidate would be this really great woman, and could we hire her too? And in my case, it was a junior search, and they got it changed to a senior search. So it was sort of sweetening, and yeah, the pot. Other stuff in the back. Yeah, you want to just shout, and I'll repeat it? Okay.
Discuss the issue of family life, quality of life,
family
and
life.
Dealing with a family.
Yeah.
Will the culture change to give women credit for essentially taking a break from career, or the constant juggling of doing all of that and raising a family?
Yeah.
That's a huge issue which impacts career advancement. Can you discuss?
Yeah, great. So raising the issue of family life and the disproportionate hit it takes on women, because women today, at least in the U.S., still do more than half of all the family care obligations. Sheila Tobias actually gave a fabulous talk in 1992 at the first Women in Astronomy meeting. And one of the things she pointed out was that, you know, our modern universities were invented in the monasteries of Europe. And basically, they haven't changed. If you're a professor, you are supposed to have been born with the calling. Okay? There are those who are born with it and those without. Also, you're supposed to be a celibate, you know? No time for that. And, you know, you're just, all you think about is your research. And that's the model. That's the model we reward, in fact. So we should rethink that. Think about medicine. Let me go back there. Medicine is an incredibly demanding profession. If medical school, you're on call every 3rd or 4th night. If you want to be a specialist, you have training. Your training takes 10 years. It's exactly the same situation as, say, a scientist getting a PhD in terms of the amount of time you have to devote to it and the age you are when you're devoting it. And yet, we have a ton of women doctors, and we have very few women physicists. So that's not due to family. And I will also say that women with family are not doing any worse than women without family, as long as they stay full-time. We don't have a part-time faculty track in universities. Why not? Why not? a few universities have pioneered that, and it seems to work. So I don't know why we can't think about it, but anyway, we don't. We don't have, men aren't picking up their share of the burden. I'm sure everyone in this room does. But
Meg, I would just add that was a conscious decision in the medical profession to change the way doctors were trained, because that notion of having, when you were a resident or intern, being on call for days on end, which was thought to be what made you a great doctor, ended up killing people, most notably a woman named Libby Zion, because people make mistakes. And I know from my ex-husband, who was doing a doctorate in genetics when we were young, if you're in the lab 24/7, you're doing things like, in his case, putting the gel in upside down and putting the electrodes on the wrong poles. It makes you crazy. It makes you unhealthy. Losing a marriage, you're not raising your children. It doesn't necessarily make you a better scientist. So in medicine, they realized that, and they changed the training so that it was not a hazing, and it did not lower the standards of medical care. It did not make for worse doctors. It just made for people who didn't go crazy, kill their patients, and lose, and in doing so, it opened the field to women. And I think a conscious effort has to be made to make graduate school and the early years of a career, when, which are also to be childbearing years, more, just healthier for everyone.
more family friendly.
And
Yeah.
get rid of the notion that that's somehow going to lower the quality of science. I think in some European countries, there's more of a notion of a more balanced life, and you still have great scientists, and it helps both the men and the women.
Yeah, so it's also the case that we could do much better than we do. I mean, universities have now mostly adopted parental leave policies. Most universities have a stop the tenure clock policy. That didn't used to be true. Most universities have maternity leave now. When I was having my babies, at least the first one, I was on disability because we didn't have maternity leave. And we didn't have a lactation room because my HR person told us we couldn't give women a benefit that men didn't get. So I said it was fine with me if the men came to pump breast milk there, but it still didn't happen. Anyway.
Except, Meg, you know what? I've been to so many colleges to give talks where the women actually don't have even maternity leave, where they are expected to keep teaching, even, let alone doing the research. It's,
Okay, so maybe not, yeah.
Yes, but there's still a shocking number of places that don't even have the maternity leave, let alone.
And I think partly that's because for years the faculty have been men who have wives at home doing taking care of everything. So they haven't agitated for that. What do they agitate for? They want tuition benefit for their children, or they want a dental plan, but they aren't asking for time off to do X or Y because their wives are doing it for them. So I think partly it's getting more women in the profession. Those things will become obvious. I think childcare on campus is a huge one. I think any university that has abundant, high-quality childcare on campus will get the very best students and the very best faculty. And I think if any man had ever dropped his 6-week-old kid off at the babysitter's, he would institute daycare the next day, within half a mile of his workplace. I mean, really, men aren't doing that, and that's why they don't see how difficult it is, in my view. Yeah, Jim, you had something to say a long time ago. Sorry, I forgot.
I was fascinated by this professor who said they don't encourage anybody. So this means that, the really effective encouragement must be a rather subtle process, body language and so forth. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So actually, I'll let Eileen talk about that particular professor, but I think the real issue here is that women seem to need encouragement to feel they are good enough, and men don't need the encouragement. They'll go do it anyway. And if anything, sometimes they need a little discouragement so they think a little harder about things before they decide they know everything, right? I mean, we have a quintessential example of this in the White House at the moment. A man who has no doubt of his ability to do anything. He's mastered healthcare now. Before, when he hadn't realized it was complicated, but now he's mastered it. So he's 85 Sigma, from most of us. But But still, I think the difference is that, and when by the way, I'm sure I speak for Eileen on this one. When I say men and women, I mean most men and most women socialized as they are today in our society. There's certainly people who don't fit those stereotypes. Do you want to add something, Eileen?
Yeah. Well, what I would say too is, in fact, all the gender bias studies show that women show as much gender bias against other women as men do. There's virtually no difference in how much, the responses in that. So it's something we all grow up. In terms of the encouragement, so this is very common that people say, I'm very careful, I don't encourage anybody, or I encourage people equally. And so the sociologists have done studies, specifically on science professors, actually, in terms of, the study was done in terms of responses to emails. So they had somebody pose as a student who wants to come study with you in a graduate program, says, I'm going to be in town next week, would you meet with me? And they measured how likely the professor was to reply at all, or to reply positively and say, yes, I'll meet with you. And it depended on whether the student was perceived as male or female, Asian, Caucasian, Black. It was very field dependent and was not equal. So that in terms of whose question do you answer after class? How long do you spend answering that question? Whom do you invite out for a beer? That kind of encouragement is very unequal, and often, even just saying to someone, so have you thought about graduate school, right? That's more likely for a professor to say to a white male or somebody who's like him. And it really has a huge effect. Just to give another example, I got an email from a woman who clearly was brilliant. She had, she told me her qualifications in math. She was in grad school, and it was just amazing. And a professor took her and some male graduate students to their first conference and said to some of the guys, well, you're going to present papers. And she said, well, what about me? And he said, oh, no, you really have to be super good to present a paper. And she thought he knew something about her, and that was a real judgment on her abilities. She actually left the field. And she looked back and she read my article and she said, oh, my God, he didn't even really know who I was. He had no idea about my grades or the awards I had won. I mean, she was spectacular. This was somebody who was going to win a Fields Medal when she stayed in. And so these subtle ways of that professor had no idea that just by saying that he was encouraging somebody and that somebody else who was far better than anybody he was encouraging had left the field. So, it just works in these subtle ways of, even answering a question. Do you look at the person? How long do you spend? How seriously do you take the question? And many people just aren't aware of how unequal their responses really are. And again, as Meg said, that girls are brought up to really look to others for encouragement, whereas guys are sort of supposed to just, keep up, pretend that they're confident no matter what.
Another strategy, trying to shift a little bit to what can we do about these things rather than what are all the things wrong. One of the things we can do is have groups, particularly for young women, I think, to have a group of friends who can give you honest assessments and encourage, be your little cheering section. It's a matter of just realizing that the environment as currently structured is a little bit toxic, and making it a place that you can thrive in, consciously making it a place you can thrive in.
And I've heard from women who had a male advisor or lab head who encouraged and created such an atmosphere. No matter that they were male, they were encouraging many, many women to go on. So, I mean, it's not just something that women can do. It can definitely create, a really encouraging, environment.
So I'm noticing that I noticed that it's after 4, and probably some of you have to rush back to work. So I think we could close it here. But I'm happy to stay, and Eileen, I'm sure, is happy to stay for a few more minutes if people want to come up and ask additional questions. So thank you for your participating, and yeah.